Yes, we are wrapping up Rule 3 from Jordan Burnt Peterson's Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. Do not hide unwanted things in the fog. But before we get to that, he's back on Twitter from his somewhat self-imposed exile, and it's been a wild ride. In addition to being all up Elon Musk's and Justin Trudeau's ads, as well as taking fashion notes from Batman villain fan art, he's been blowing up news about his professional organization wanting him to act professional. Why he's making this public now, despite the initial decision coming down back in November, I don't think he's said. He has said, though, that the primary reason the clinical psychological professional organization he's a member and therefore representative of by his actions, the main reason is his tweets involve Canadian politicians. He focuses in on the complainants not having been clients, though I'd hazard a guess from looking through his file containing all communications that them showing up identifying as such is an artifact of how complainants get registered more than them falsely identifying themselves as former clients, especially reading through their complaints when they clearly say they never were but have concerns about his harmful impact. For some strange reason, he neglects to mention the contents of the tweets that people are complaining about, where he goes against climate change, COVID measures like vaccines or masking, the general medical and psychological standards of care for trans and or non-binary people. You know, things that I imagine his professional organization would like him to knock off. Well, with that out of the way, let's finish up this rule. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi, and welcome back to this cognitive psychologist who is absorbing some of the psychic damage coming off of this book. Let's start with a recap of this foggy chapter. Peterson's father-in-law didn't like the tiny plates his wife used for lunch and didn't let her know for years. A former client was unhappy in her marriage. Peterson put the problem as being represented by their clash in decor preferences. She didn't have the damn fight, and they ended up divorced. Neither sins of omission are as bad, if not worse, than sins of commission in Peterson's book, which makes him more savvy than Freud. Also, repression. I think that about covers it. So, quick refresher of the visual cues I use to indicate where ideas are coming from. This means I'm paraphrasing the book, this means I'm responding to the book, and this means I'm talking about the solitary reference left in this chapter. Poor little guy. Been waiting all this time for us to get to it so it can join its friend, the other reference from this chapter. And please humor me that we're gonna pretend that I moved all of this up and everything to be in front of the bookshelf because my nerve thing's been going off all night and another setup is another 30 minutes at least of moving all the equipment and just no. So just pretend we're in front of the bookshelf. Ooh, references, science. So get comfy with your super soft pedantic pants and citation needed hoodies, available from my Fourth Wall Solar link in description. Click the subscribe and like buttons, and let us settle in to stare at the Lovecraftian fog that is Peterson's writing. In this chapter on not hiding things in the fog, we are finally defogging the fog with an explicit-ish definition of what the fog is in the fourth of 5 sections in this chapter. And it starts with a style-mad opening, because of course it does.
Imagine that you're afraid. You have reason to be. You are afraid of yourself. You are afraid of other people. You are afraid of the world. You are nostalgic for the innocence of the past, for the time before you learned the terrible things that shattered the trust characterizing your childhood. The knowledge you gained of yourself, other people, and the world has embittered more than enlightened.
It's saying something about how this book is going when I have to commend his restraint in not bringing up Adam, Eve, and the forbidden fruit of knowledge. Again, this seems like a good time to remind you, dear viewer, that Peterson includes himself in the group needing his advice.
I've never suggested that I was anything other than one of the people who also needed to learn these lessons. So I included myself in the population of people who needed some moral improvement.
Remembering this can make reading these books almost like listening into a dialogue he's having with himself. He's afraid. He's nostalgic. The world has made him bitter. This also fits with some of his advice from 12 Rules, that you need to bounce your thinking off someone else. In this case, it seems like the book is acting as that other person for him. Fear, hopelessness, ignorance is bliss. All of this leads to a mental downward spiral in a Yoda sort of way. Knowing wants means those wants can be hoped for and denied, which somehow lets you discover what constitutes failure, which will make you feel like it's your fault you failed. So instead, you hide your wants from yourself and don't introspect about why you're unhappy, frustrated, and nihilistic. One of these things is not like the others. But you are also afraid to communicate your apparently unknown wants to others.
First, if they were to find out just what you wanted, then they might tell you, and then you would know, even if you were fighting against gathering that very knowledge. Second, if they knew, they could then deny you what you truly wanted, even needed, and hurt you much more efficiently than they might if your deepest desires, and therefore your vulnerabilities, remained secret.
I didn't accidentally a word or part of the sentence there. This is how it is in the book. I'm not sure what other people might tell you after finding out your wants. For the second point, a bunch of follow-up advice is missing from this book. It can absolutely be hard to tell other people what you want or need. I 100% get it. You are making yourself vulnerable in this process. But it is super important that you develop this communication skill, if for no other reason than you can use people's reaction to your wants and needs as a metric for whether or not they're worth keeping in your life. If you share a want or a need with somebody and they laugh it off or they respond harshly, they are sharing something with you about themselves in this process. Listen to people when they do this. This is important information. Don't feel like you have to neglect your needs in order to keep somebody in your life. Peterson's focus is on the self-knowledge as opposed to the knowledge you're gaining from other people in this. And don't get me wrong, that is important information, but it's not the entire picture here.
The fog that hides is the refusal to notice, to attend to, emotions and motivational states as they arise, and the refusal to communicate them both to yourself and to the people who are close to you.
As is often the case in these books, I feel like a lot of the setup to reach this point, at the very least, could have been streamlined. But hey, we'll take explicit definitions where we can.
The question, did that happen, begs the question, what do you mean by happen? Because when you are dealing with fundamental realities and you pose a question, you have to understand that the reality of the concepts of your question, when you're digging that deep, are just as questionable as what you're questioning.
He gives some examples of potentially foggy things like a bad mood, anxiety, or depression. And these are foggy because finding out the cause will probably suck.
The most probable outcome of successfully articulating an emotion that has accrued without expression over time is tears, an admission of vulnerability and pain, which are also feelings that people do not like to allow, particularly when they are feeling distrustful and angry. Who wants to dig down into the depths of pain and grief and guilt until the tears emerge?
I agree that it's important to figure out why you may be feeling negative in some way. Don't just let that stuff fester. It might suck to figure out the cause, but I don't think that's guaranteed. Like, sometimes I wake up and I'm just irritable, like capital irritable. Most of the time, it's just my brain is frizzed out for whatever reason. I can acknowledge that, let my husband know who's sharing the house with me, and try to shake the bleh. But something like that isn't always the case, and it can suck to figure out what the root cause is. But long term, it's better to not fogify that sort of knowledge and address it as soon as you can. I also want to give credit where it's due and focus on the positive side of this, not the sometimes weird or uncomfortable interview stuff. Peterson is opening up a broader range of emotional responses for guys. It is absolutely fine and normal for boys and men to cry about things. How this fits together with the whole toughen up bucko vibe, I'm not sure. Something else that can block your ability to introspect is other people. So if your partner says something that hits a foggy nerve, you're likely to snap back to shut it down. He calls this two things: a test to see if the person's willing to put up with that from you and also figure out what's bugging you, and a defensive act to keep the fog foggy. Then you will feel worse when your defense goes untested. I saw this sort of behavior growing up, and holy shit, it sucked to watch. It definitely helped foster a sort of say-it-straight mindset that I'm admittedly not always the best at. My criticism here, though, is the almost certain deterministic style of his writing. This is how things go down. This is how you're thinking and acting. He cycles through that last idea a few times before moving on to another doom spiral.
And you must still live with yourself. In the short term, perhaps you are protected from the revelations of your insufficiency by your refusal to make yourself clear. Every ideal is a judge, after all. The judge who says, you are not manifesting your true potential. No ideals, no judge. But the price paid for that is purposelessness. This is a high price. No purpose? Then no positive emotion, as most of what drives us forward with hope intact is the experience of approaching something we deeply need and want. And worse, when we are without purpose, chronic, overwhelming anxiety, as focused purpose constrains what is otherwise likely to be the intolerable chaos of unexploited possibility and too much choice.
One of my margin scribbles for this paragraph is, what is this? And I have to agree with past me. What is this? This seems like such a sharp turn from the unwillingness or inability to communicate one's wants or needs with other people. Oh no, it can't just be that you're not living the most authentic life you could be by not sharing your needs and wants with others. It has to link into this much larger problem of intolerable chaos leading to overwhelming anxiety. But that is a masterclass in doom spiraling. Not figuring out and sharing your needs and wants means you are insufficient and hiding from the judge that is your manifested ideals, which means you have no purpose, which means you have no positive emotions and are anxiously overwhelmed by the chaos that would otherwise be manageable if you could only sort out your needs and wants. And maybe it's because we just finished up Abigail Schreier's Irreversible Damage about transgender non-binary youth, but I can't help but think about some of the stories from people where they talked about the negative impact ignoring their not cisgender identity had on their lives. So I'm not saying that not addressing these sorts of internal things can't lead to problems, just that Peterson has a tendency to blow it into grandiose proportions. Pivoting away from the anxiety spiral, he says that you're probably going to fail regardless. It's just a matter of failing because your communicated needs aren't being met, or failing because you didn't even try, which is robbing yourself of a learning experience. And he says that success tends to come from many iterations of the failure and learning from what went wrong cycle. I don't hate this. Absolutely, normalize the process of learning and the many failures that can come with it. But then there's the but. Why is there a failure cycle in communicating your wants? Well, lucky us, he has a sort of answer to that question.
Sometimes all that learning, impossible without the failure, leads you to see that aiming your ambition in a different direction would be better. Not because it is easier, not because you have given up, not because you are avoiding, but because you have learned through the vicissitudes of your experience that what you seek is not to be found where you are looking, or is simply not attainable in the manner by which you chose to pursue it.
Beyond order drinking game that will get you at least a little bit buzzed. Take a shot every time I ask for an example, because here's another one. An example would help loads in clarifying what he means by this, because right now, it's a little foggy. Let's say you want something in your relationship with your partner. We're going to go with the example that just lodged itself in my brain and refused to move because my mind is in the gutter. Hypothetical you. A red-blooded American manly man who loves Lobster Daddy in a platonic way, wants your wife to peg you. You communicate this to her. In this illustrative example that is building in failure, let's say she's uncomfortable with the idea of it. I guess the iterations would be you asking in different ways and her staying firm in her no. So then you see that aiming your ambition in a different direction would be better, because what you seek is not to be found where you were looking, or is simply not attainable in the manner you're trying. Which, yeah, sure. Everyone has their boundaries, and in this example, the wife's excludes pegging her husband. I guess this process would tell the husband to find the sort of experience he was hoping to get in some other fashion. Like, are there any other bedroom activities the wife would be on board with? To be honest, and maybe it's just that I'm a little bit dense, but I wasn't entirely sure what Peterson was advising here until I worked through that example. If someone isn't totally understanding the intended meaning there, I could see this potentially enabling somebody like the nice guy to keep up a harassment campaign because surely, eventually, he'll learn enough from the experiences to get the right approach with his affection target, where she'll just drop on her knees and swear eternal love to him. Maybe he'd grok the quoted part and start seeking elsewhere, hopefully a little wiser for the experience. But I feel like that requires more insight than is typically demonstrated by the guys doing this shit, and so they may err on the side of changing the pursuit tactic. Moving on, because I feel like I might be thinking these things through harder than Peterson, and he's on to the next idea. The alternative to hiding things in the fog is to admit to your feelings, which he says is hard and also not the same thing as just giving in to those feelings. He's got 2 reasons for why it would be tricky to admit your feelings, in a numbered list even. But I wanted to pre-note here the assumption that the feelings shared would be negative.
First, noting, much less communicating, feelings of petty anger or pain due to lonesomeness, or anxiety about something that might be trivial, or jealousy that is likely unwarranted is embarrassing. The admission of such feelings is a revelation of ignorance, insufficiency, and vulnerability.
Yes, clearing away the fog on these sorts of feelings would be hard, especially if it feels like your partner is the source of those feelings. Telling that to them is going to be painful for you and quite possibly for them too. But it's possible to struggle to admit positive feelings too, especially if you're feeling an attraction to somebody and you're not sure if the feelings are mutual. Not everybody has the nerves of steel of modern-day philosopher Katya Zamolodchikova, who could just walk up to people and say, "I am physically attracted to you and would like to have sex with you. You down?" I was going to question the negative framing here from Dr. P, but thinking back through the chapter, it's been the setup the entire time. Negative feeling after negative feeling. Of course, everything isn't puppies and unicorn farts all the time. There's good and bad. I just find it notable that he's focusing on the negative here.
Second, it is unsettling to allow for the possibility that your feelings, however overwhelming and convincing, might be misplaced and, in your ignorance, pointing you in the wrong direction. It is possible that you have misinterpreted the situation entirely, for reasons of which you remain fundamentally unconscious. It is for such reasons that trust is vital, but trust of the mature and tragic sort. A naive person trusts because he or she believes that people are essentially or even universally trustworthy. But any person who's truly lived has been or has betrayed.
Yep, and there. Nothing like feeling hurt about something that happened, getting those feelings out there, and then the sudden gut punch when you realize you had misread the situation. My advice for this is to just own up and admit it once you realize what's going on, and then try to do aftercare for everybody's emotions. Like, me misreading the situation, realizing I misread the situation, isn't going to magically make my hurt go away. It might lessen it, but it's still something I need hugs and reassurances for. On the flip side is your partner having to deal with the potential hurt from the false oath accusations. Like, this is a process where healing can happen, ideally, and you can come away better for the experience. The next part is on trusting people, with the broad statements on the fundamental deceptive human nature you would expect from him. You can be justifiably pessimistic, or you can have courageous faith in people and offer them trust by way of expressing vulnerabilities and sharing feelings. It even includes a little bit about a potential betrayal being something that could be forgiven, as long as the person is sincerely sorry about it. My advice addition here would be to have a sliding scale of trust where for new people, you have something that you could potentially be burned on, and as you gain more trust with them, they get to have more access to things. So a new friend, trust them with things that you might not necessarily want to be public, but you'd be okay if they ended up that way. See what happens. This is a way that you can build up trust with people. At this point, I trust Dr. Mr. the husband with pretty much everything, and yeah, that could majorly bite me in the ass at some point down the road, but I don't have any reason to believe that's going to happen. If your gut is telling you not to trust somebody close to you with things, don't ignore that feeling. Don't immediately yeet that person out of your life because of this, but pay attention to it. For people I've known who've come out of bad relationships, to put it mildly, they had those gut feelings throughout of just, I don't trust them about this. I'm not liking this, but you can explain away a lot in the moment. It's only after, and they've had some time to introspect and think about the actual state of the relationship, they regretted not listening to those gut feelings earlier. Less severely, you may have people in your life, friends, family, coworkers, who cannot abide a secret. They may be perfectly lovely otherwise and wonderful to have around, just don't share with them the more top secret parts of your life. The final paragraph of this section isn't bad, aside from the lobster icing on the advice cake. There's even an example, which basically boils down to using me versus you-centered language. In keeping with the maybe cheating hypothetical scenario from the last section, instead of saying, "You have been ignoring me lately," try, "I feel isolated and lonely and hurt, and cannot help but feel that you have not been as attentive to me over the last few months as I would have liked, or that might have been best for us as a couple. But I am unsure if I am just imagining all this because I am upset, or if I am genuinely seeing what's going on." The second is direct without assigning blame or intent on the other person's behalf, while also working to clear the fog. And it's good to clear the fog because you can't avoid the danger you can't see coming. The second sentence gave me pause because it's only the better sentence in certain contexts, and even then it could be improved. We'll start with the criticism I have for some phrasing. Bringing in the "might have been best for us as a couple" seems manipulative to me. Part of the point in using I sentences in these conversations, as opposed to you sentences, is to focus on the things you feel and know, instead of statements built on your assumptions of intentions or thoughts the other person might have. This helps reduce the odds of the other person feeling pushed onto the defensive and trying to justify their actions and thoughts, instead of actually just listening and responding to what you said. Peterson's example does that for the most part, but that little addition of what may or may not be best for the relationship changes the tone. With it, it's also saying the speaker is speaking the truth for this joint endeavor, that they know what the relationship needs, which implies that the other person doesn't. To edit this into more me-centered lingo, it would be something along the lines of, "And I feel like that has hurt my relationship with you." I think it's roughly what Peterson was going for there, but keeps it still in me-centered language. Moving on to the context note, the second sentence is not something that should be said if you're in a relationship with someone manipulative or abusive. For example, we'll work with the client's story from towards the beginning of the chapter. The woman who is married to someone who hoarded art, which is the thing Peterson put as integral to the core problem in their relationship, as opposed to the husband's described self-centered and overly concerned with how he appeared in the eyes of others, narcissism. Assuming Peterson gave her this latest advice as opposed to the going to war from earlier, based on what we heard about the husband, here's how I think it would play out. The client, under Peterson's sage guidance, concedes that she is actually bothered by the home decor, so tells her husband, "I don't feel comfortable in our home. I have been informed that I do not like your collection of pop art and would prefer a more Spartan aesthetic. I feel like I am subordinate to your taste." As we talked about in the first part's video, this is sort of along the lines of my advice. Have a discussion about this, although it would be better done before the art hoard was collected, but it's never too late to have these sorts of talks. However, that is assuming the client's husband would be able to positively receive this information and join in on the discussion. The self-centered and narcissistic descriptors suggest that might not be as likely to happen. If the husband continues to refuse to listen to what the client is saying, even the best crafted me sentence will fall on shut or apathetic ears. And that's a best case scenario. From my experience, there's a range of responses the client could expect. The husband could play the victim, where he spins her statements as attacks anyways, even though she's not intending them to be, and then launches his counteroffensive. It could be about the client's discomfort being weaponized against him to make him feel bad, and he's a terrible spouse and she doesn't love him, and blah, blah, blah. The client's feelings of preference subordination could be flipped back on her. That the decorating stuff is the only way the husband feels he can express himself in this relationship because she controls everything else. It could be any number of things. The possibilities are endless. If the client responds to this how I think a lot of people would in this situation, she'd probably just drop the request and try to soothe her husband's feelings. She's sorry that he feels this way in the relationship. What can she do to make things better for him? Just try to glue everything back together and move on from the mess they accidentally triggered. But now the husband has this relationship talk turned fight to use against the client, as well as potential weak points to use against her in the future. If she communicates another need, want, or boundary that puts the husband out in any way, he can try to shut it down by bringing up the hurt from last time to not have to change. And if the husband feels like he needs to get additional concessions from her, to assert his dominance over her, or just to fuck with her, he can push those vulnerabilities. Double or triple down on the art collection. Do other things around the house to alienate her further. Make his dominance known in things other than decorating, like maybe buying a car or booking them a romantic weekend away that'll only really be to his benefit. Granted, I'm doing a bit of hypothetical if-then chains myself here, but it's in the service to encourage you to do these sorts of conversations with people you trust. If that isn't your partner, start working on an exit plan. Only including advice on how to use me-centered sentences in relationship talks without more explicit acknowledgement or emphasis on red flags to look out for is potentially setting people up for more chaos and problems. Buried in more Peterson-y prose is the idea that events happen without telling us why, and our memory of things isn't perfect. He continues on to say,
"The information in our experience is latent, like golden ore, the cakes we made in Rule 2. It must be extracted and refined with great effort, and often in collaboration with other people, before it can be employed to improve the present and the future. We use our past effectively when it helps us repeat desirable and avoid repeating undesirable experiences. We want to know what happened, but, more importantly, we want to know why. Why is wisdom. Why enables us to avoid making the same mistakes again and again, and if we are fortunate, helps us repeat our successes."
Not this latent experience stuff again. Although, there is a nice little bit of symmetry here with him bringing up the thinking as talking with other people thing from 12 Rules, which I brought up earlier this video. Speaking of that rule, he's touching on his working definition of memory again. He's not defining it as clearly here, but in his previous book, he called memory a tool with the purpose of guiding our behavior based on past experience. For all the importance and latent meaning he sees in stories, it strikes me as odd that he seems to have such a utilitarian view of memory. Like, yeah, survival is arguably the evolutionary point of memory, but there's also other things we get out of it. Remembering my deceased loved ones doesn't fit into this utility. Yay, at least, for including the potential positive side of memory this time around, as I brought up his emphasis on the negative and punishment last time. But I feel like why is only part of the information we'd need to learn from events. What and how seem pretty important to know too. And an interesting new variant on wandering out into the why are we talking about this weeds and losing sight of the point, we're instead led on a journey on the path's point, just with patches of meandery fog. He says getting useful info from past experience is hard because of many verbose reasons, so it's easier to not.
Unfortunately, in the longer term, this willful blindness leaves life murky and foggy, leaves it void, unseen, without form, confused, and leaves you bewildered and astonished. This is all a strange concatenation of the psychological and the real, the subjective and the objective. Is something frightening, or am I afraid? Is something beautiful, or am I imposing the idea of beauty on it? When I become angry with someone, is it because of something they have done, or my lack of control?
This is our second of 2 references for this chapter. As a reminder, the first was on a philosophical aside that didn't add much. Given this reference's placement, what do you think he's going to point us to? If you guessed Genesis, good job. Follow-up, it may be a good idea to lay off the lobster for a little bit. What a weird coincidence that Peterson's writings would line up with the variant meanings of tohu vabohu. Truly, this is indicating something deep and profound through synchronicity. And his Rorschach writing style strikes again. I thought I could make an interesting contrast between his writing and his tweeting with regard to beauty, but now that I've got the not beautiful tweet and this quote both in front of me, it could cut both ways. If you take his writing to indicate a hint of the subjectivity of philosophical aesthetics, the tweet would be inconsistent. But if you take the writing to indicate that we can impose the beautiful quality onto things, suggesting they might not be otherwise objectively, it would be consistent with the tweet. And we are now the dragon chasing our own tail and trying to imbue meaning into style-mad writing and are losing the main thread. Again.
Do you believe in God? What do you mean do? What do you mean you? What do you mean believe? And what do you mean God?
Sorry to say, Anne, but it depends on what you mean by this. It depends on what you mean. You become postmodern all of a sudden.
Right, so he gave example questions you might ponder that are strange concatenations of the objective and subjective. You only ponder these types of questions when the bottom has fallen out of your world because bad things happened and now you're confused. Is this part of why he has such a rage boner against postmodernists? that they ask these sorts of questions and make his bottom uncomfy.
This is your captain speaking. To avoid flying through a pretty dense layer of chaos fog, we're going to start our end of chapter descent into Mega-style Madnessville early.
The ground of being is subject and object simultaneously. Motivation, emotion, and material thing all at once. Before perception is clarified, before the world is articulated. The wife remains uncomprehended. The context of her speech remains unexplored, for fear of what that exploration might reveal. The situation cannot be described because the word is left vague and unformed. Our own personal motivations begin in hidden form and remain that way because we do not want to know what we are up to. The wheat remains unseparated from the chaff. The gold remains in the clutches of the dragon, as does the virgin. The philosopher's stone remains undiscovered in the cutter, and the information hidden in the round chaos beckoning remains unexplored. Such a mission is a voluntary refusal of expanded consciousness. After all, the conflict of the whole world has its beginnings in the darkest part of the forest, and what you need remains hidden where you least want to.
I want to ding this for missing references since he brushes up against perception and some psychological-ish things, but then it goes so far off into its own little inscrutable pocket dimension that I just... Huh? Do not hide intended meaning in foggy writing. How about that rule, Peterson? It was basically in your last book. Don't hide things in your closet. Spiral, spiral. Tiamat will pop out of said closet. You will impale yourself when life forces you to run out into the fog. Raisin cookies of doom spiral, and, you know, actually, I may want this for later because it always comes back to hurting the world with him, so roll for Constitution.
Corruption will beckon to you, led as you increasingly will be by dark, unexamined motivations, bred by failure, amplified by frustration, viciously culminating in the resentful belief that those who have transgressed against you are getting from you exactly what they deserve. This attitude and the actions and inactions it will inevitably produce will impoverish your life, your community, your nation, and the world. This will, in turn, impoverish being itself, and that will be exactly what your darkest unexamined motivations desire.
Yep. Linking your ability to communicate in a relationship to the health of your country and world feels like a bit more of an ass pull than something like the necessity and sufficiency of the meritocracy from the first rule. And since he brought it up from the local relationship scale to the global, this opens up this chapter to a critical question. What is a person to do if they figure out the cause of a negative feeling is out of their hands? What should the reader do if they can't communicate to the government or megacorporation or other big institution that their needs aren't being met or that they're being harmed? Oh well, at least we're at the last paragraph. The pivot from the doom fog into the bright sunshine of Peterson's advice.
With careful searching, with careful attention, you might tip the balance toward opportunity and against obstacles sufficiently so that life is clearly worth living, despite its fragility and suffering. If you truly wanted, perhaps you would receive if you asked. If you truly sought, perhaps you would find what you seek. If you knocked, truly wanting to enter, perhaps the door would open. But there will be times in your life when it will take everything you have to face what is in front of you, instead of hiding away from a truth so terrible that the only thing worse is the falsehood you long to replace it with. Do not hide unwanted things in the fog.
We all at least followed Peterson on his path from saying communication is important to marriage to saying life is worth living and all that, but I'm still a bit mystified at how and why we ended up here. But it wouldn't be the end of one of his rules if he wasn't making big promises of what following his advice will get you. I don't like what this truly is doing here. It seems to add this air of potential failure coming about because you didn't want, seek, try to enter hard enough. Life advice that leaves the back door of, well, it didn't work because you didn't work it, is generally not good advice. As can be the case in Peterson's advice books, if you distill things down enough, you can end up with drinkable advice that won't cause blindness. Certainly the case for this chapter, for the most part. Address problems in relationships when they come up. Communicate what you're feeling, as well as your wants. Check in with yourself on how you're doing, and don't ignore yourself. That third section, well, the gist I pulled is Freud missed the mark because he didn't consider sins of omission enough. I suppose that is sort of consistent with the rest of the chapter, if you consider not adequately communicating in your relationship to be an omission sin. In my opinion, that's not really adding anything helpful to the discussion. But then there's the Peterson problem. When distilling your advice moonshine, it's important to not throw out the fourth shot for many, many steps of the distillation process, because it can be really hard to separate out from the heads and hearts that you actually want. And boy howdy, if there isn't a lot of text you have to run through to get to the good stuff. That the framing for addressing relationship problems was consistently as some form of a fight, instead of including that these talks don't have to escalate to that point. That he effectively shamed a former client for never going to war and destroying her husband's property. That it is your duty as a member of society to communicate with your partner lest you impoverish the world with your willful blindness. The uncontextualized inclusion of Freud's repression mechanism. The many doom spirals of what will happen if you don't heed this advice. The lobstery fluff surrounding the advice would be less concerning for me if a sizable portion of his fanbase didn't seem to accept the ideas coming out of him uncritically. In a pleasant change of pace from how these alternate advice parts tend to go, I don't have much to do on the alternate advice front. Just some light reframing or perspectivizing. Open and honest communication is critical with other people, particularly those you're in a more intimate relationship with. People aren't mind readers, so you're going to have to let them know what you need and want. Likewise, if something's bothering you, let them know, don't make them figure it out on their own. Relationship talks don't have to be fights. If anything, I'd say if it turns into a fight, put the relationship talk on hold, let everybody calm down and cool off, and then try again. Boundaries are a part of your needs. You need to figure out which ones are flexible and which ones are non-negotiable. Communicate these to others and reinforce when necessary. If someone ignores or denies your boundaries, especially repeatedly, pay attention to that. It is possible for a boundary transgressor to learn and grow and mature and stop it, but at a certain point, it isn't your responsibility to force that growth. And finally, pay attention and listen to yourself. If something's bugging you or you just have a general sense that something's off, spend some time thinking about it. Maybe it'll be that you could use a Snickers. Maybe it'll be something that's more difficult to fix than that. Either way, you need to work on addressing these things as they don't tend to get better on their own. So yeah, defog your life or something. Up next is Rule 4. Notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. That just rolls off the tongue so naturally. That one. Anyways, until next time, bye.